All right. Well, like 10 minutes ago, I wondered if anybody's coming. It's like I said to Jane, this is like church. Everybody shows up like 2 minutes before the service. Thank you all for coming again. This is one of my favorite lessons to teach because there's a saying that Vanguard has, which is like stay the course. And so they're trying to encourage people this idea of not trading, not moving around. And I'm a big advocate of that philosophy, but it's very difficult to do that if you don't have like the information that I talk about in this class. I remember as a young person, it was just like mind-boggling to me. I didn't know that much about investing, and I had started to put money into the stock market. I had put money in the bond market, but it particularly was mind-boggling to me because it seemed every time I would do really good in the stock market, then boom, it would go down. And why? I mean, I just didn't have any idea of why. I mean, the talking heads on TV would say, well, it's profit-taking on the part of the big investors or different things like that. But there was never, I didn't really understand the economic cycles behind which drive the stock market and the bond market. And I took it upon myself to learn. And it proved to be a very valuable tool. I'm not one for timing the market. I am not one for advocating jumping around. But I will say that back in 1999, I took all the things that I had learned and I put them together. And it just said to me that there's going to be something major happening in the stock market. To me, it was just the handwriting on the wall. I just cannot see having the risk that I'm taking as far as my asset allocation. And at that time, this is before I really started wholeheartedly endorsing indexing. I had a whole variety of different mutual funds. I had a whole portfolio of, I think, upwards of almost 20 stocks. And I started really evaluating the risk of these different investments. I'll be talking about like PE ratios in this class, in part of this lesson. And I looked at PE ratio simply as an investment term, kind of explains how many dollars you're paying for the earnings of a company. And I looked at some of the companies that I had, and they had PE ratios in the 80s. And I was like, whoa, if the stock market is risky, these stocks are beyond risky. And so I took the stuff I'm going to talk about in this class, the information, I put it together, and I made a major asset allocation change from being 70, 80% in the stock market to down to only 20% in the stock market, 80% in bonds. And I started in 1999 and finished in January of 2000. And we proceeded to have, the market just kept going up. I mean, we just had a tremendous rally in the stock market, and that went all the way until March. And then the you-know-what hit. And the market just so many people got wiped out. I remember I did my first class. It was in January of 2000. And I said to anybody in that class, in your company's 401ks, if you look at your different things, I would highly advise checking out the money market or the fixed, the stable fund inside of there, and changing your asset allocation, because I think there's something bad going to really happen in the stock market sometime. No one ever can time it directly and say exactly when it's going to be, but definitely there's ways to evaluate the risk you're taking, and it proved to be very, very fruitful to me. Now, the recession of 2008, my asset allocation was already conservative enough. I couldn't have timed that. I didn't see that coming because a lot of the parameters I looked at weren't in place. That was kind of like a stealth one that snuck up on everybody. But it's really given me, knowing this stuff about the economics behind the market has really helped me to be a patient investor. So I take my asset allocation, and next week's lesson is really how do you build a portfolio for life? And that is your asset allocation. We've already talked about it's simple to pick the investments. To me, it's beyond simple. If you get yourself a really good bond fund that's appropriate for where you are in the interest rate cycle, and you use a total stock market index fund, hey, I mean, it really works for me. I mean, you can add other stuff to it, but that should be your foundation if you want to keep it simple. It's the asset allocation that's really the key here. And what allows me, since 2000, I have been about 50-50. And what's really allowed me to be there is that I take what I've learned about the economics behind the stock market, and I can go in at a given year, and I can say, you know what? Probably not going to make any money this year in my asset allocation. It's probably going to be a pretty bad year because of the fundamentals are not there for a big rally in the stock market. And so when the stock market really stinks, hey, it doesn't bother me because I fully expected it. And then on the other hand, when the stock market is really bad, I'm at my peak of optimism about what I'm doing, because if you take what you'll learn in this class, you find that that is the peak point of financial opportunity, is when the stock market is really bad and the economy is really bad, because from there we always bounce back. And there's mechanisms in place that help us to bounce back. So that's why this lesson is really important. Not that I'm advocating you go out there and time the market, but it helps you to be more patient if you have a proper asset allocation that allows you to handle the volatility. And I have found that if you have that knowledge, when everybody is just panicking, you pretty much say, you know what, it's not going to last forever. And I see things happening where, there's going to be good things. So anyway, before I do that, though, I have to share you this one with you. My wife gets the Our Wisconsin magazine. Anybody get that in here? It's really a cool magazine. I mean, it's got all this quirky stuff about all Wisconsin, beautiful pictures and stuff. But there is a section in there called Church Chuckles. Do you ever read Church Chuckles? You got to check it out. Well, anyway, she says, "Oh, Jeff, you got to hear this one." Okay, so this pastor had a congregation, and he asked for testimonials amongst the congregation of things that you could be thankful for in your life. And so this woman was attending the service, and she had a little boy named Cedric. I assume he must have been like 3 or 4 years old, something like that. So Cedric stands up. Everybody looks at him. And Cedric says, "You could save big money at Menards." Things to be thankful for now. It struck me because the power of advertising. You got a 3 and 4 year old. You could save big money at Menards. Yeah, but money and kids and stuff, that I like that one. The second thing I wanted to do before I start the lesson, and we're already on to the 4th lesson here, and I have failed to mention this. People always thank me for doing these classes, but I've done classes, the high schools, the personal finance classes, done classes at Ripon College. I've done classes at Manitowoc, Appleton, Fond du Lac, Oshkosh Senior Centers. Done classes when I used to do them at Oshkosh North. None of those classes would have ever been possible if it weren't for people that saw what I was doing and took the time to make the facilities and invite me to their facilities, set them up to do the classes. We wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't for the lady sitting there, who is Jane Wells from the Oshkosh Senior Center. I walked my niece's dogs today, and I went on the river walk. Her car was here, and that was like between 1 and 2 o'clock. So I don't know how many hours you're going to be here today, but I can't express how much I appreciate you sacrificing your time and setting this up, because it's not like this is benefiting me other than emotionally, but I know how much these classes benefit people. And when people take the time, I mean, there was Dottie Winkleman at the Senior Center in Fond du Lac when she was there, and a lady by the name of Penny in the Manitowoc one. There's, Dan Quinn from Ripon College. There was a guy named Walt Tack who had Jetstream Car Wash that arranged at Moraine Park for me to do classes at Moraine Park. It's like all these people, the last 25 years of doing these classes, people have taken their time, and so many people have been helped because of that. So, Jane, you're just one of the many, and I really appreciate that. So, I think we should give her a hand. I really do appreciate it. All right. So, this class, like I said, is about the economics behind the stock market. What moves the both stock and the bond market? So you can't discuss any economic system without talking about inflation, because it's probably the number one thing that you have to watch determining the health of any economic system. So it's kind of easy to teach this class, because, I mean, previous to this last couple of years, we really have had almost no inflation for an extremely long period of time. And having gone through the post-pandemic years where we had the 9% inflation, I mean, we all have, I don't have to teach you or talk to you about how bad inflation can be to one's financial health. So inflation is part of economics. It's simply put, it's a product of supply and demand. So if you're looking for a definition of inflation, it's so interesting to me, because when I would do the classes at the high schools, inevitably I ask any of the students, does anybody in here, can you give me the definition of inflation? And they would all like raise their hand, and I was at the schools for 20 years, and over the course of 20 years, there was never a student that gave me the definition of inflation. They always explained inflation as, well, that's when the value of our money goes down, and that's so I don't know why they got that definition, if they're taught wrong or whatever, but that's the byproduct of inflation. Inflation simply is the increased costs of goods and services. That's what we experience, the increased costs of goods and services. So is inflation bad, or is inflation actually good? And I would advocate that, an economy is in trouble if it doesn't have inflation. Now, why would I say that? I say that because inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods and services. So if you don't have inflation, that means that there's not enough money to create more demand. Now, if you don't have inflation, so let's go back to, where does the money come from? So if you're talking about an economy, it's based on people spending and buying goods and services. So where do people throughout their lives get most of their money? You would say what?
I was daydreaming.
Oh, you were daydreaming. Oh, okay. Where do most people get their money? By working. Wages, right? So basically, if you had, you said, oh, well, inflation is bad, that would simply mean that people are not making any more money. That basically they're never getting raises. Because basically, people get raises. As they become more productive, they're rewarded, they get raises. So when a company raises wages, what do they have to do to maintain their margins? They have to raise prices accordingly, right? So not necessarily. We're going to talk about that. Actually, companies can give people raises, maintain their profit margin, and not raise prices to the wholesalers. It's possible. I'll explain how that happens. But in general, there's a limit to how much they can do that. So basically, inflation means that people have more money to spend. They're spending it. They're creating more demand than there is necessarily the balance of supply, and so prices go up because companies have to raise prices. Okay, so inflation is not necessarily evil. It's a necessary part of any vibrant economic system. The point is, there has to be a balance between the wage increases and the price increases. And when they get in an imbalance, that's where inflation really becomes a problem. When you have inflation that far exceeds wage increases, then basically, as those kids in high school said, when your buying power goes down, then people can only buy less. And when people have to buy less, then companies are selling less. And when companies are selling less, then companies are making less profit. When companies are making less profit, their stock value goes down. And you're not happy as you're an investor. It's just a chain reaction. So inflation is the basic thing that you need to be very aware of in an economic system. So the government does a pretty good job of measuring it, and they measure it through something called the CPI. So the CPI is the Consumer Price Index, and it's calculated by our government. They have agencies all around every section of our country. And you can go on the computer and you can look it up. But there's literally thousands of things that people go out every month and they check the prices of it. So it's pretty obvious that in California, probably a loaf of bread costs a lot more than in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. A home in California costs way more than Oshkosh, right? So what you have to do is you have to take this basket of stocks and be representative all over America. And then what you do is you add it up, and then you say how much did it increase or decrease. So you get the grand total together in every section to get a quantitative average of increasing and decreasing. And so in a mature economic system like we have in the United States, most economists say that a healthy CPI or inflation rate is somewhere around 3%, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3%. But it gets a little more complicated than that because most investors understand that there's two elements of this basket of stocks that are extremely volatile. And they don't necessarily are not rooted so much in wages going up, so companies have to raise prices. That's food and energy. Those are two very, very volatile things. And a lot of those are determined by weather and geopolitical situations. I mean, brace yourself. If this thing blows up in the Middle East, and all of a sudden the oil gets, temporarily halted, I mean, you're going to be in for a shock on oil prices. That's just the way it is, and consequently gas prices. And now that has nothing to do with wages. And like we had Hurricane Katrina, which knocked out a lot of the infrastructure of energy down south. That raised gas prices very fast. So basically, when you're looking at the thing that investors look at to really tell if inflation is ingrained and becoming a problem, you want to look at what's called the core CPI. And the core CPI is price increases excluding food and energy. So, because they're not so much tied back to wages. Okay, so inflation matters because it devalues corporate profits and wages. In other words, if a corporation reports, oh, we had 9% profits this year. I mean, that's a pretty good year. But if inflation is 9%, how much did they really earn? Nothing. In other words, those dollars were wiped out because prices increased the equivalent amount. So it definitely hurts corporate profits. So that's one of, and it also hurts obviously wages. It encourages forward consumption. So stop and think about that. What is a favorite sales tactic of? One right now. I hear it on the radio. Do you know that there's new regulations coming in? I forgot what it was. It's something to do with an appliance. And now they have to have some extra things that they have to add to it for monitors on it and stuff like that. So buy it now before we have to install those, because there's going to be a major increase in the prices. They always do that with cars. So my favorite story is the one that I shared for years. I love peanut butter. Yes, I love peanut because it's cornerstone of my daily routine. Is got to have peanut butter and jam sandwiches in the morning. And thanks to Chuck here, who turned me on to a particular raspberry jam. I mean, and I'll tell you, Chuck, I was totally bummed out because my niece picks those up for me, and she was too busy for 2 weeks. I ran out, and I had to buy X brand. I mean, I got to the point I had a hard time choking down my peanut butter and jam sandwiches because this raspberry jam, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because you'll go out and take it. There's a limited supply. But anyway, getting back to the peanut butter. So I was walking the dogs one day, and I had my radio on, and they come in with the news. And at that time, they said, oh, my God, we had a drought in Georgia. And the peanut crop was not good this year. So all you peanut butter lovers, watch out. Price of peanut butter is going up. So what did I do? Every time I was at Walmart or Pick and Save, I'm buying 6-7 jars because we got a big pantry, and I'm hoarding all this peanut butter. I got it all stocked up in there because, by God, they're not going to get me. I'd probably cause the shortage myself. But that's what consumers do, is you get in this inflationary cycle, and people know prices are going up, so they just hoard it, and they keep buying it. I mean, and that just drives the price higher. It penalizes investment lending. Once again, if people are investing in bonds and stuff like that, and you have hyperinflation, if the bond is, if the yields are not rising fast enough, people are hesitant to buy bonds, and that's bad. It rewards debt. That's not good. It decreases purchasing power, and it forces interest rates higher. And the higher interest rates, as I know, is difficult for companies to borrow money, costs them more to borrow money, cuts into their profits, which once again is not good for you as an investor. So inflation it matters. Got a chart here kind of just showing you, it's like how inflation affects purchasing power. It's an older chart, but in 1906, what you bought for 46 cents, in 2006 cost $10. Fast forward, what you could buy for $4,621 costs you $100,000 in 2006. If you had $46,000 back in 1906, that was the equivalent of being a millionaire today. Isn't that something? It's incredible how inflation cuts away purchasing power. In fact, if you look at inflation and you can maintain inflation around the 2 to 3% area, it takes 24 years to devalue your money and cut it in half. But if you're running double that and you're running 6% inflation, I mean, basically about every 10 years, your money is purchasing power is cut in half. So think how bad it would have been if we wouldn't have gotten out of that inflationary cycle that we had when we were running between 6 and 9%, especially if you're retired, because it's really, you're limited how much you can earn. You're living on investments, and if the investments are, the purchasing power of your investments are getting cut in half. In other words, you have a $500,000 portfolio and you live another 10 years, I mean, it just devastates it. So inflation is a problem, and you have to be very cognizant of it, and you have to watch it. So what rates of inflation are concerning? If inflation is anywhere below 3% in that area, that's kind of green light. Once again, I have it here in red. What you don't want to have is deflation. I know everybody loves a sale, but if everything in the economic system's on sale, that's even worse than inflation. Deflation causes depressions because companies just can't sustain a deflationary environment. They just aren't, they're making no profits, and they basically go under. So the one that you really want to watch is the core CPI, but I mean, sometimes that's hard to get, but usually they talk about it, and that's released every month. All you have to do, it's so easy to be good at this now with computers and the internet. I mean, all you have to do is Google search CPI and core CPI, and you can get the government's statistics on that, basically on a monthly basis. But it really doesn't have to be that sophisticated. All you have to do is look at your life. Look around you, and you pretty much know if prices are increasing rapidly and stuff like that. So what do we do to counteract? And I gave the example to you is there are situations where companies can actually give people raises, sometimes substantial raises, and not have to raise the price and still maintain or even increase their profit margin. And that is through something called productivity. So productivity basically is a measure of the output of goods and services on an individual on an hourly or daily basis. So in this example, what I did was I took a company that makes gizmos. And when was the last time you bought a gizmo? Really, you haven't? I mean, you don't know what you're missing. But anyway, gizmos. This company, I use them as an example. They make gizmos, and it's a local company here in Oshkosh. They have 10 employees. So the gizmo factory guy, what he did was he broke it down, and he took the wages, the benefits, the raw materials, all the other insurance costs, and all that up, because that's what business people do, is they get a base idea of what it costs to produce a gizmo. And it comes to about $5 a unit. Now, his 10 employees, they're currently producing about 1,000 gizmos a day. So what this business owner did was he modernized, got new computers in, maybe new equipment, and working the same number of hours, these 10 employees are now producing 1,200 gizmos a day. So he made the investment in this technology or machines. Of course, business owners can write that off over the years to come in depreciation. So, yeah, you could say, well, that cut into that, but you amortize that out. So basically what it did is it brought the unit cost down to $4. So if you do the math here, he's making an extra $1 on every gizmo. And he's producing 1,200 of them a day times 5 days. So that is 600 gizmos. That's a lot. But anyway, what he can do is he can take that money and give a portion of that money, that extra profit, to his employees as a raise in their productivity and reward them. And then he can take whatever is left to increase his profits, and he can maintain the price. Everybody wins. Productivity is something that's happening, and that's, if you're seeing this tremendous surge in the market, if you look at the fundamentals this past year, so far it's been a really good year, and you're wondering, well, we have pretty high interest rates, we had inflation, and prices aren't coming down, so people are still feeling the effect of those inflation. So how come the stock market is doing so good? Well, part of it is that the stock market is looking at AI. Investors are looking at AI. And it's hopefully going to be a major boon to productivity through our economic system. And it's going to help corporations lower the cost of production and price stability and stuff like that. That's what's happened. As I said, if it wasn't for the pandemic, I think we would have never had the 9% inflation and stuff like that. Because basically since the early 1990s, it's been one major technological breakthrough after another to help increase productivity. I read one particular story, this was a while back, about a semiconductor company. And they actually make the semiconductors overseas. And basically, it broke down. And they were able, via computer and telecommunications, to fix it within hours, remotely from the United States. Which is, think about how productive that was. If you'd have had to send technicians overseas, fly them over there and fix it, and they were able to fix it in a very short time. Just think of all the different things that have helped workers and us as individuals become more productive. So productivity is a major tool in being able to maintain economic growth, maintain price stability, and increase wages. That's one of the, not to sidetrack here, but it's one of the things that I scratch my head when we've had this, once again, it's political, so I mean, I shouldn't be talking about it, I guess, but to me, it kind of like, I scratch my head because I think in economics. And this whole minimum wage thing, when people are saying, well, we should have a minimum wage of some number like $20 an hour. So I'm thinking like, okay, that person before was working for $10 an hour. Now you're going to give him $20. Did he increase the productivity? To me, the root of wage increases should be based on an individual's productivity and worth to the economic system, not some political thing. So, I mean, I like the idea of having a base wage, and a simple way to solve that whole problem would be, and they should have done this, I don't know, when was the minimum wage enacted? Anybody know that? I know there was a minimum wage when I was in high school. 1938? Because back in the day when I got my first job, it was $1.25 an hour. You know how much I made? $1.25 an hour. And I was darn happy to make it back then. But just think if we would have just indexed it to inflation. Simply index it to inflation, and then it would take all the politics out of it. But bottom line is, I would really like to see people to understand that in an economic system, your wages really are based on your productivity in importance in an economic system, which is the reason why Jordan Love is making $55 million. Except when he throws 3 interceptions. Okay, so one of the ways that we counteract inflation and try to moderate prices is through increased productivity. But like I say, that is limited because you just can't instantly create new technologies, and you can't make people. There's a limit to how much you can work a person until they become non-productive, right? So then we need mechanisms that efficiently attack inflation and economic growth and the sources of inflation. And that is interest rates. Interest rates are a vital cog. So we're looking at the things that we're looking at so far as investors is we're looking at the inflation rate, and then we're also looking at how productivity is doing, and most importantly, we're looking at the relationship between the interest rates in an economic system. So interest rates are set 2 different ways. We basically have a central bank in our country. It is called the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, we're in an election year, and everybody thinks you're, like the next person that's going to get elected president. Your life is going to be changed so much by that person. But frankly, the person that probably has more effect on our daily lives and our quality of life is actually the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He's probably one of the most important people in the whole world as far as maintaining quality of life and a good economic system, because he is the one that is faced with the job of trying to maintain economic growth, but also keep inflation in a targeted range. An extremely difficult job. And when they are successful at doing this, then you have a decent economy. And when you have a decent economy, then people have jobs. People are working. People are getting wage increases, and people are able to consume and buy the things that they need in their life. We're not talking about politics here. We're just talking basic economics. So the Federal Reserve is one of the most important things that I watch as an investor. And they have immense powers. The Federal Reserve first of all, controls the money supply. So when money is printed by our mint, that money does not get allocated into our economic system unless the Federal Reserve releases that money. In other words, if the Federal Reserve wanted to slow an economy down, as an economy grows, it needs money. And although the government is printing money, that money doesn't get into our economic system unless the Federal Reserve allows it. So let's go back to the 1990s. From 1995 until the recession in 2000, most people didn't pay any attention to this. But the Federal Reserve at that time was hammering down on the money supply, was not releasing money. In other words, they didn't add money to the money supply. And in so doing, our economy was growing tremendously. It created a shortage of money. And when there's a shortage of money, then the cost of money goes up. So they literally raised interest rates in the economy simply by not increasing the money supply. It's a tremendous tool that they have. But even beyond that, when they are releasing money into the economy, they determine the cost of that borrowing. So we had almost a tremendously long period where the Federal Reserve was basically charging nothing to add to banks that were borrowing money from the government. So all the money we have, theoretically, is borrowed from the government. The banks have borrowed it from the government. And the Federal Reserve sets the overnight lending rate. So when a bank borrows from the Federal Reserve, then they have to pay interest on that. So it's interesting because we went from Oshkosh West, and we went on a field trip to Chicago. And I don't think they allow this anymore, but back then you could go to the Federal Reserve. And there's branches all around the country. And we sat in this room, and it was a lecture on one of the guys that works there. And then after he got done with his lecture, he asked any questions. So I asked him this question because it intrigued me. Think of the billions of dollars of interest that the Federal Reserve collects on the money that they release into the economy. And I was intrigued. I said, what do you do with it? What do you think they do with it? Party! No, he didn't say that. Actually, it just blew my mind because he told me at that time what it was. I think the previous year they had collected, I don't know how many billions of dollars of interest. Annually, they take it and hand it over to Congress, and they spend it. Amazing, isn't it? It's just, and yet they're running those deficits. I mean, they're getting but anyway, the Federal Reserve has immense powers, and as we saw in the last recession, in the pandemic, they have different tools to manipulate interest rates. For instance, during the pandemic, and even before that, to stimulate and keep interest rates low, the Federal Reserve actually went out and was huge borrowers of mortgages. So they created liquidity and lowered the interest rate because they created demand. So they kept lowering interest rates, and the demand was still there, so interest rates go lower and lower and lower. They drove down interest rates because they created the demand for mortgages and the loans and stuff like that. They're holding the loans. It was called QE. Now they're unwinding QE. It's like all these different tools that they have to manipulate interest rates. And the other one is the marketplace. So, as I said, the government spends money. So where does the government get this money to spend? Well, obviously taxes they collect, but they're running, last couple of years, like trillions of dollars. They're spending more. So where do they get the money? They sell bonds. So bonds are sold by the U.S. Treasury in auction. When corporations issue bonds, they are an auction. So basically, the marketplace determines those rates. So you have the bond market, which we are investing in. Those rates are set by auction. And then you have the base rate, which is set by the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve rate is very influential because it's directly tied to banks and basic short-term loans and stuff like that, which are very important in the economic system. And they do have some effect on these. So anyway, as I said, the Federal Reserve purpose is to control inflation and maintain economic growth. And you can see that is like almost ironic because if you maintain economic growth, then that's going to create inflation, right? Okay, so then you have to have this mechanism and these tools to try to keep economic growth in line so that you don't get that inflation above the 2% that's their target for the core rate, and 3% on the other. They're more concerned with the core rate. So it's a very, very difficult job. And I'll tell you what, we have been blessed by some awesome, awesome Federal Reserve chairmen. If you go back to when I was a young man, we had hyperinflation back in the 1970s. And it took the courage of a Federal Reserve chairman named Paul Volcker. He hammered the overnight lending rate and raised it. I believe it was, I don't have that chart, but I think it was close to 19%. Think about it. Raising the overnight lending rate, which is tied to lending rates, to 19%. Who in the heck could afford to borrow rates? It hammered the economy and caused a recession. But what you saw was immediately inflation, which had been persistent throughout the 1970s into the early 80s, just came crashing down and set the stage. So politicians love to glorify Ronald Reagan as the president that brought us prosperity, but actually, well, Reagan did have something to do with it because he appointed Paul Volcker the chairman, but it was really the courage of Paul Volcker. And then in the 1990s, we had Alan Greenspan, and then Bernanke, and then Janet Yellen, and now we have Paul. So we've had very, very competent Federal Reserve chairmen. I'll tell you what, if politics gets involved in this, and they ever appoint some guy or gal into the Federal Reserve chairman who's not hawkish on inflation and, listens to the politicians and, keeps interest rates too low when they shouldn't be too low, I'm going to suddenly become an international investor. because really, so much of the prosperity we had is because we've had great Federal Reserve chairmen. Once again, they're appointed by the president. Probably one of the most important things that I'm looking for the president to do right is to get a good Federal Reserve chairman, because they really are important in our lives. Okay, so if you look at their job, when they put interest rates and they knock them down, that's really good for employment. So as employment booms, then that's more people earning money that they didn't have before. That's billions and billions of dollars added to the economic system, and especially if people were unemployed or had just part-time jobs, and all of a sudden they're getting full-time jobs and they're earning a decent, nice wage. What do you think they're going to do with it? They have deferred spending. They probably have old appliances, an old car, maybe they haven't bought a house yet, and all of a sudden they get a good job. They're out there spending. That's all very stimulative to the economy. So that's inflationary. So that it's great to have low interest rates, and also, but the low interest rates is also inflationary. So, like I said, the Federal Reserve job is really difficult because they want that healthy economy. They want that growing economy. But they have to be very cognizant of the fact that if the economy gets too good, it creates inflation. Okay, so inflation goes up. Another effect that it has on investors is when you start to get high interest rates, people look at the bank, and the banks are offering 6% on a CD. Or you can invest in a bond fund, and the rates are 6% in a bond fund. All of a sudden, you're looking at the stock market, and you're going like, wow, I can get at a very low or no risk investment, I can get 5 and 6%. That becomes competitive with the stock market. So when interest rates are high, then that's a new competitor for money to go into the stock market. That can affect the performance of the stock market. But interest rates, when they go down, it really increases the need to take risk. So if you go back to pre-pandemic levels, we had some really, from 2008 on until 2020, we had tremendous years in the stock market. And one of the explanations I can give is, where else could you put your money to make money? I mean, if you put it in the bank, what were they paying on savings accounts? 0. If you put it in treasuries, what were treasuries? 10-year treasury was under 2%. In other words, you lent the government a 10-year treasury, you made less than 2% over the course of that 10 years. Corporate bonds, interest rates were really low. So in an environment where you had these really low, we're talking how interest rates affect investing and the stock market. Really low interest rates are great for the stock market because, once again, it increases your need to take risk, and it's very stimulative economic growth. But, once again, it can create inflation. So, rising interest rates, it reduces your ability of individuals to borrow money. So, when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates recently to 5.5%, now they dropped it down to 5%. Think about how that affected people's ability to buy a home. I mean, I gave the example of my nephew, who I have 2 different nephews that bought in the houses. And I have a nephew that lives in Cleveland. And he and his wife bought a house about 1.5 years ago. The interest was 7% for the mortgage. I'm sure it's come down. They're probably going to refinance, but how many people can afford that, to pay that much interest? I mean, just do the math. I mean, it's incredible how much you'd have to pay just on interest before you even pay principal. So it really reduces people's ability to borrow money, to borrow money to buy things, and it increases the cost of doing business, as businesses have to borrow money for short-term needs. It increases taxes because of the cost of running the government increases. So we don't think that, the federal government hasn't raised taxes yet, but last year the government spent over $1 trillion last fiscal year just to pay the interest on the debt. We keep hearing this number, our debt is $35 trillion, but to pay the interest on the debt, over $1 trillion. Is that sustainable? It really isn't. Hopefully, this year interest rates come down somewhat, so it helps you to finance the debt, but it's a major, major problem. It discourages demand for stocks because of the available of competitive yields at less risk. So interest rates rising is negative to you as an investor. As a bond investor, interest rates rising are negative to you because the share price of your bond fund is going down. And that all stems back to inflation. So going forward, as investors, pay attention to inflation. Pay attention to what the Federal Reserve is doing in response to inflation. They're very transparent. And the Federal Reserve meets about every 6 weeks. It's not rocket science to find out what they're doing. So, based on history, when the Federal Reserve is somewhere between 0 and 3% for their base rate, that is basically like you driving your car and putting your foot on the gas. And the lower this is, the harder they're pressing on the pedal. Okay? When the Federal Reserve rate is between 3 and 4.5%, then you're taking your foot off the pedal, and you're neither braking the economy, you're not stimulating it. Where we are right now is the Federal Reserve still has their foot on the brake. But rather being down on the floor like they were, they moderated it. And if I was a betting man, I would say they're going to stay here for a while and not rapidly go down to green. Because I don't think that necessarily the inflation bug has been kicked. I still think you have to be very careful about reigniting inflation. You don't want to re-stimulate the economy too fast. So I think we're going to have a gradual thing. But for us as investors, this is a good thing. If the Federal Reserve moderately lowers to here, that's great for us as bond investors because we're slowly bringing the price down. But we're not bringing the price of the interest paid by the bond fund down too fast either. Get it? Because if they just rapidly descended down to 2% or something like that, all those nice yields we're getting in those bond funds would rapidly go down, and then we're back to what we were before, where we had basically super low yields in bonds and basically hardly any return on bonds. So hopefully what I would like to see going forward is we moderate into, they get back down in around the 3%, but they don't have to crash it down to really low rates, which means we haven't had a bad recession or something like that. So I do have the chart which talks about what Paul Volcker did. Look at this. Back in 1982, 19%, 1981, he put the federal overnight lending rate to 19%. If I would have a corresponding chart, I wish I would, showing the inflation rate, it would very much correspond to this chart. How rapidly inflation came down because of what Paul Volcker did. And you can see when we got back in the early 2000s all the way up to like 2020, this line didn't change much. And now we have bumped up to around here. So historically, the 5% we're in right now is not crazy. It's really not crazy. Okay? So, going back to my example of what I did back in 1999. Okay, we had an inflation problem. We had inflation that was running much above my target. We had a Federal Reserve that had raised the overnight lending rate to, I believe, 5.75, maybe it was 6%, something like that. It got pretty high. Those were two things. But this was the camel that broke. This is what did it for me. Because, I'm a shopper. There's one thing I hate is paying more than what I consider the value of something. In other words, I have no problem buying a Callaway driver. That might cost way more than a Fleet Farm driver because I know that Callaway driver is going to get me at least 15 more yards than a Fleet Farm driver. So the value is there for me. So I'll pay for that Callaway driver. Get it? Well, I looked at stocks, and it also applies to toilet paper. I'm getting my cushable stuff because, man, that cheap stuff, I might save $1 there, but boy, my hiney pays for it. So I am going to buy them. Get my point? So I'm looking at stocks. And back in the 1990s, I looked at something, I said, the PE ratio of the stock market. So basically, the way they figure the PE ratio of the stock market is, rather than all stocks, you can get it for the total stock market index. It's really easy to do right now. If you just type in VTI, that is the ETF of the stock market. Next week I'll talk more and explain ETFs. But this is the total stock market index, and you'll see an icon that says PE ratio. And it tells you the price that investors are paying for every dollar average dollar of earnings for the companies inside of it. I think one I really pay attention more to is the S&P 500. So, because 75% of all the money is invested in the stock market are in these 500 companies. So the P ratio is basically pretty easy to figure out. You take the earnings of each of these companies, these 500, and you add it all up. And then you take the S&P 500, you divide it out, and you get the earnings per share, average earnings per share of the P ratio of the S&P 500. So, you know, for me as an investor, I'm pretty happy in a historical norm when it's somewhere between 50 and the low 20s. That's a range that I'm pretty comfortable with, providing that inflation is reasonable, interest rates are reasonable. That historically is said that's a nice range for the price, meaning I think that's fair value. Well, if you go back to the late 1990s, the price to earnings ratio of the S&P 500 shot up to almost 38 times earnings. So investors were paying roughly $38 for every $1 of earnings. This is a historical norm, so that's double. So, like, you're walking into the store, and a gallon of milk normally is $3 a gallon. And all of a sudden, tomorrow you go in there, and it's $6 a gallon. Your reaction would be like, holy cow, I'm going to a different store. You know what I mean? Because that's outrageous. Yet, if you go back to the 1990s and early 2000s, people couldn't get enough of the stock market. They ignored the valuations that they were paying for stocks. They just simply were overpaying. And also, right now, if you look at the price to earnings ratio of the stock market currently, it is considerably higher than the normal. It's in the mid-20s. It's high. So back in 1990, I looked at this checklist of things. You had a Federal Reserve which said, we are going to keep raising interest rates until we slow this economy down because we have an inflation problem. People simply ignored it. I believe they got up to 6.5%. I think it was like 6.5%. They peaked out in March of 2000. But anyway, I could check that. But I know it was much above the normal. So I looked at inflation, I looked at Federal Reserve policy, and I looked at this and I said, man, that's why I made the change. The handwriting was pretty much on the wall. So when you're looking at the P/E ratio, pay attention to it. And I kind of, on an annual basis, I pay attention to it. And then I evaluate, because I have seen this behavior in the market. We may not have a bear market. In other words, this year or next year, we may not have a bear market because I think the underlying fundamentals of the stock market or our economy are good. We have inflation that's come down to and moderated tremendously. We have a Federal Reserve which is lowering interest rates and doing a pretty good job of not crashing interest rates and watching it to keep inflation under control. But going into 2025, we have a very high price-to-earnings ratio on the stock market. It's at nosebleed levels. So basically, in investment terms, we have what's called corrections. So when you see a correction, that means that the indexes have dropped 10% or more. So anytime the stock market goes down 3, 4, 5, 6%, that's just normal volatility. When the market drops 10% or more, then we're talking about a correction. So even though most of the things are, in my opinion, in pretty good shape, that high price to earnings ratio is historically, I've seen it over and over again. We have corrections to readjust the valuation of the stock market to make it of value. It's just, I think it's going to come. And you just accept that as an investor. You can't time that. You just live it and work through it. Okay, so the events that lead to a bull market. Low inflation. Okay, check. We're getting into an environment of much more manageable and low inflation. We're not there quite yet. Affordable interest rates. Check. We're not quite there yet, but we're heading in that direction. That increases consumers' ability to spend. In turn, that creates jobs. It increases corporate profits. It increases stock value. It's just a chain reaction. It's a chain reaction. So the things that you want to pay attention to is you want to have inflation in the 3% range. Especially you want to see the target is 2% on the core inflation. Productivity, you want to see it increasing at least 1% annually. That's pretty hard to quantify, and it's hard to get that data, but you like to see it, and when it happens, okay. The Federal Reserve policy, accommodative to lending. So the Federal Reserve has turned to being more accommodative. They aren't there yet. They're still, the foot's on the brake. So they're not there yet. Interest rates, you want to see them under 5%. Money supply, you want to see them expanding the money supply. Job growth, we need to maintain a healthy economy in America needs to produce between 90 and 110,000 jobs. Okay, we had a sell-off. It's interesting. We had a sell-off in the stock market maybe a month or so ago when the jobs number came in at like 140,000, and oh my God, there was only 140,000. That is way above the norm. But we were creating jobs on steroids. Coming off the pandemic, when so many people were laid off, we were creating jobs like 300,000 and 400,000 every month. It was insane how many jobs were being created. So I think we're going to normalization. So going back to what I did back in 2000, I looked at this too. And all of a sudden, if you look at the recessions, every one we have, when those job numbers crash, and all of a sudden you see basically no growth or very low growth in the jobs number, that's trouble. The economy is in trouble. Because the companies are not hiring people. Companies just don't react like, oh, gee, the data comes in, so we better lay people off. Companies are looking at orders a year out. And they base hiring on the business that they have coming in the future. They don't just react day to day. So when you see job numbers collapse, that's a big sign of a bear market coming. It really is. So I like to pay close attention to the monthly job report, and you should too. But if all of a sudden they report 120 or 130,000 jobs were created in September, to me, I'm going like, wow, we're just back to normal. Before, we were just on steroids. That's not a sign a recession indicator. If all of a sudden for October or November, you're seeing 50,000 and then 30,000, then I would say maybe we are going for a big slowdown and possible recession. Jobs numbers will tell us this, okay? So in an economic cycle, you have low interest rates, low inflation, ample labor supply. That is the recipe, the stew that creates economic growth. When you have all this going on, increased consumer confidence, the American consumer is probably the most exuberant consumers in the whole world. We love to spend money. And, you know, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. If you look at Japan, they're like super savers in Japan. They just like save like crazy in Japan. The Japanese stock market has been in a permanent bear market since God knows when. How many years? 30 years now? It's like the fact that Americans are consumers is a good thing. It's not a good thing when they get crazy and they go in excessive debt. But the fact that we have when we have consumer confidence, we tend to spend. That's healthy for the economy. It increases consumption. It gives companies pricing power. It reduces the labor supply. These are inflationary. Eventually, that inflation increases shortages of labor and raw materials. It creates more demand for money. It raises interest rates respond by going up. It increases the cost of borrowing money. It reduces people's ability to consume. That reduces economic growth. Consumer confidence drops. Unemployment rises because companies aren't selling as much. They're laying people off. Corporate profits drop. The stock market goes down, bear market. And then it sets the stage for the recovery, and then you go all over again. In other words, as I said, for you as investors, the maximum point of financial opportunity is when this is at its worst. Because what you have is the Federal Reserve steps in, drastically lowers interest rates, prices come down rapidly, inflation disappears. In fact, sometimes you have deflation, and then you rebuild off of that. It happens over and over again. This kind of reminds me of Groundhog Day. So, if you're looking at the big four, they are inflation. You want to see inflation in that target range, 3%, 2% on the base rate. Interest rates, you want to see borrowing costs. Look at the mortgage rates. If mortgages are in the under 5%, that's very stimulative to the economy because the housing industry is a huge part of our economy. And if people can go out and borrow money on a car at an affordable rate. Federal Reserve policy, accommodative. We have turned the corner. They're reducing rates. They're not accommodative yet, but they're heading in that direction. The P/E ratio of the stock market. Sub-indicators to watch is job growth. I would be very nervous if the jobs number all of a sudden starts spiking up again to 300,000 and 400,000, those numbers again, because that is tremendously inflationary. It's just, that means our economy is reignited. Companies are hiring, they got the work. That's a problem, okay? Housing sales, that's important. Productivity, GDP growth. Our economy, historically, if you're growing in the rate, in the 3%, somewhere north of the inflation rate, auto sales, and wage growth. You want to see wages growing marginally above inflation. If all of a sudden you see, like what we had after the pandemic, you suddenly see this huge surge in wage growth because everybody was trying to get workers and that's very inflationary. It's not sustainable to do that. So on the surface, wage growth is great, but when it increases too rapidly in a short period of time, it's hard to accommodate any inflation rate with that. Okay, now, are you all thoroughly confused? I told you it was simple. But these are the things that, as an investor, pay attention to these things because it'll help you to be calmer. Because we will have recessions. They are part of any economic cycle. But the awesome thing I've observed is because the Federal Reserves have been so competent in my lifetime, We've had some bad recessions, but we've always bounced back because of the Federal Reserve doing their job and because of the economic system we have here. Very innovative. The fact that companies, we don't have all these restrictions on companies. Oh, you can't lay people off. You can't go, in some countries, they can't do that, and they have a hard time adapting to economic cycles. In America, we are able to do that. It's not great for the people getting laid off, but it's part of the overall long-term prosperity is the fact that corporations have flexibility on what they're doing and adaptability. And we do have a great economic system here. Any questions? No questions? Come on. You must have some question. Do I have to let you go early? Okay. Really? No questions? I have to laugh because I did a class last winter down in Fond du Lac, and I had a hard time even getting through half a class because they constantly were asking questions. I loved it. I loved it when people asked me questions. It doesn't even have to do with a nice lesson, but the fact that I don't know exactly what you're thinking, and I'd rather address anything you're thinking because it's that, it doesn't have to be with the subject here.
All right, I'll ask a question then.
Good.
So, political cycle, I know you don't want to get political, but, you hear buzzwords and you hear phrases all the time, and corporate greed is a big one that I'm hearing a whole bunch of.
Mm-hmm.
How much of the current inflation do you attribute to corporate greed?
Okay, his question was corporate greed. So I love that question because, like when I was talking to high school kids, if being a businessman, I kind of understand some of it. I had just a small business, so but we have in town we have Oshkosh Truck. I mean, it's a major corporation in America, isn't it? So, what does Oshkosh Truck do with the money?
The money that
They make.
You would assume that gets brought towards product development and paying their employees better.
No, they party. As I said, it's total party. I mean, really, trips, airplane trips. I mean, they just blow it. They're on the beaches. So, yeah. Once again, this whole corporate greed. Well, corporations, are owned by the shareholders. Their responsibility is to make a profit for the shareholders, which in turn they have a responsibility of using those profits to either give it back to the shareholders. So once again, how many Americans have 401ks and investments in the stock market? Those greedy companies. In other words, those profits get funneled back in the form of dividends to investors. And second of all, you hit the nail on the head. Oshkosh Truck is in a very competitive business. And they have to bid these things out. And I can't fathom how much they spend on research and development in order to develop the vehicles and the next generation that's coming and so forth. So if a corporation doesn't make a profit, then they don't have the money for research and development. Those evil drug companies. You know what I mean? We all want cures for cancer. We all want cures for this. We all want cures. But if they don't have the money to develop those things in the form of profits, then all those marvelous medicines aren't going to be available. So people look at sometimes prices and they go like, oh my God, it's got to be greed. But they don't understand necessarily all the costs involved. Is there excess corporation profit? I would think the medical field is definitely an example of where, and I'm not an authority on it, But I know that years ago when we had like a company in town that made crutches. What was it, Lamico? Yeah, Lamico. Well, the guy that owned it asked me if I wanted to see his plant and look at it when it was still there. And I said, sure. And so I went down there and he showed me everything. He was real proud of it. And he said, well, it costs us like, I think it was like, I can't remember at that time, $25 to make a crutch or something like that. And he said, yeah, well, we sell it for $25. So they make it for less than that. But our profit margin allows us to sell a crutch to a hospital for $25. And then he says that same hospital then charges $110 for that crutch. And to me, I mean, that's ridiculous. You know what I mean? But I'm not a medical expert, so I don't know, because there's all those other factors we don't consider. How many people don't pay their medical bill? How many people don't have insurance? And then this poor hospital, because, you know, so is it really greedy, or is it a necessity? I don't know. You know what I mean? But it's really easy to scream corporate greed when prices are higher. You know what I mean? And basically my understanding of business is businesses are very competitive. All S&P 500 companies, it is hugely competitive. And you better be changing and adaptive and use your resources efficiently and smartly, not stupidly and wastefully. Otherwise, you are going to fail. And so I hear that and I just say it's a usual, you know, thing. It's just like CEOs. I mean, the CEOs make these insane salaries. And do I think they make a lot of money? I would say, God, you know, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around the salaries they get. But then again, who else, how many people can do that? It's just like I use the example of Jordan Love making $55 million. And the Packer fans are, God, I'm glad that they paid him that. You know what I mean? It's like, because how many people can quarterback the Green Bay Packers and make them a competitive team? You know what I mean? It's just, so this whole argument about who gets paid what, it's just one of those that it's supply and demand. It really is so much. Yes.
So, maybe I'm curious on your view of, like, they talk about repatriating money back into the U.S. that companies.
Right.
And on this,
Okay, so his question for the people on Zoom or on the thing. So the question is about, as I said, corporations, 50% of their profit comes from overseas. So the S&P 500 companies. So all these companies have subsidiaries all over. So previous to the last administration, the corporate tax rate was like the second highest in the world. And so a lot of those companies, the profits were kept overseas. We lowered the corporation rate, and the purpose of that was supposedly so that they bring the money back in, because the tax rate is such that, you know, it's fair, and so they're going to bring it back in and repatriate it. I can't tell you if they did or didn't. I don't know.
I guess it's somebody that doesn't have the ability to.
It's. I mean, I suppose you could Google search it.
I don't want to pay any more than anybody else, but I want to see that everybody.
Right.
No one should get a free ride because they can shelter it away. I mean,
Well,
our military.
Well, the corporations that do make that money overseas, what they do is they pay taxes on those profits. They're just paying taxes to the company, to to the country that they're in. That's how that works. It's not that they're. One of the things that the fair share thing, I hear that, that's a lot of it's really interesting to me when someone uses that thing about fair share and taxes. I think the top 10% of wage earners in our country pay over 75% of all the federal taxes. So over 50% of Americans pay no taxes, no federal taxes. Are they paying their fair share? You know what I mean? And yet I am a huge proponent of a progressive tax system. In other words, those 50% that are not paying, it's because according to the tax code, they don't make enough that we think they should be paying taxes. And I think that's perfectly all right. I think as you make more, you should pay more taxes. But I think there's a fair amount. And currently it's like 30-some% for the top wage earners. Where the fairness comes into is the fact I think the tax codes are fine. It's all the special interest deductions that people get. It's crazy. The fact that you're writing off this, writing off that, so you're hardly paying any taxes because you're writing off all this stuff. You know what I mean? You get a good bookkeeper, and that's where the system we have is failing. You know what I mean? But I think as far as saying that the wealthy don't pay enough taxes, they're basically supporting the system right now. You know what I mean? It's not that they're not paying taxes. It's just they could be paying more because of so many of the deductions they're getting. I think it would be very easy. But once again, that's where politics comes in. Because who are the donors to both the Republicans and the Democrats? And so, that's where all these deductions come. So, are we ever going to make it fair and perfectly, great? Hey, that's only going to happen when we're all in heaven. You know what I mean? It's just, we're human beings. We're never going to be perfection. I mean, as Bob Brinker used to say, we have the best government money can buy. And that's just the way it is. But compare us to the rest of the world and just stop complaining. Go over there and you'll find out. So, yes, I would like to see the tax thing reformed. But this idea that we need to change everything and, it's been tried. Do you know what the individual tax rate when John F. Kennedy was elected? I believe it was 94%, the top rate. You know how many people paid that? Nobody, because they'll find deductions and stuff like that. So just close the loopholes, get the special, all these things, and I think the tax problem would be solved. You know what I mean? Yes. It could be inflationary in that it's going to, the stuff is not going to get unloaded. I think it's much like we went through did the pandemic affect prices? Obviously, that's why we had so much inflation, is because it's a bottleneck. And back then, we shut down the containers and all that kind of stuff. So absolutely, if this drags out and all that kind of stuff, it's basically going to affect the whole country. Is it going to cause a recession? I don't think it'll last that long. You know what I mean? I don't know what they're asking, but yeah. It's probably an arm and a leg because they're in a position to do it, right? And you got to stop and think. Those poor people live in California. You know what I mean? And it costs so much money to live there. So, if you're not making $200,000, you're poor there. So it's going to be interesting to see how this develops. It is a major thing. I think eventually it'll be much like the government will have to step in and force them to, negotiate this as a natural interest. I think the government has the power to do that when it's affecting the whole economy, much like a rail strike or something like that. All right. We made it. Thank you for filling time. We made it to 7.